Thank you to those who have subscribed, and especially to my first patron at Patreon, Sandy from Environmental Coffee House. It's a real morale boost. Today, our media's coverage of the lead up to the Ukraine invasion, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and if the only lesson our media's pundits and the politicians are going to try to tell us is we weren't tough enough, that is a recipe for a future of climate catastrophe and conflict. The lesson, I think, is to examine our media's and politicians' connections to the multi-billion-dollar defense and petrochemical fossil fuel industry. Taking a passage from the Bible, do look at the mote in thine own eye. Introspection. Flipping arguments around in our heads. Start with Russian history. The former Soviet Union lost anywhere between 20 to 27 million people due to the Nazi invasion. Going ways back, there was the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. Well, think if you're an American in the USA, if you can remember 9/11 and the thousands we lost in that attack, how the mood in the public became. The Soviet Union was mostly a public sector economy when there was a Soviet Union, and it created a buffer of aligned nations and what were called satellite states around Russia. Well, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was disbanded. The public sector was sold off and privatized. There's a book called Sale of the Century that really hits that fact home. So much of the former Soviet Union and satellite states became open to foreign business interests. But also, a lot of those public assets were transferred to select party officials or former party officials who I'm assuming supported the breakup, supported the privatization, creating the class that we hear about so much today, the Russian oligarchs, the very powerful, wealthy business individuals. And there are oligarchs in Ukraine as well, notably. And much of that oligarch wealth is in the oil and gas industry. And this privatization brought the former Soviet Union in line with the rest of the world, with growing wealth disparities between the rich and the poor. But remember that this privatization and this disbanding came after decades of pressure from what we call the West. I grew up with anti-communism, anti-socialism, but what percentage of that portrayal was really all along just about opening up and dismantling that public sector so private business interests could get in there? Well, according to an underreported LA Times article I found for you, part of the negotiations and the dismantling of that Soviet Union were statements made that the West or NATO would not expand eastward. Here, the LA Times quotes former Secretary of State James Baker going back to around 1990, I believe. But that promise not to expand NATO must have made elements within the defense industry nervous. Here is a 1998 article in the New York Times that should have been screaming headline news: arms contractors spend to promote an expanded NATO as a source of expanded revenues and sales to keep its relevance. It spent billions of dollars lobbying Congress and making campaign contributions. Well, this interplay between defense industry and government goes on today, underreported in our media, who I believe also has ties to that industry. And tied in with that, the media rarely highlights the demands made by our so-called opponents in almost any of these conflicts or negotiations. So citing to the Guardian news, pre-invasion, Russia was demanding there's a guarantee Ukraine does not join that NATO alliance, and there be a limit on NATO troops and weaponry at Russia's eastern flank. So here I can show you a picture from a European news source of NATO troops conducting a drill in Latvia. Latvia is Russia's neighbor. We'll flip it around. What if there was a Russian-Chinese military alliance conducting drills off our shores, the America's shores, or at our southern or northern borders? Now, our media highlighted Russia's escalation during the negotiation process by moving more troops to the border. It did not highlight our sending more armaments to Ukraine and pressuring our allies like Germany to do the same as escalation. But it could have characterized it that way if it chose. In general, our media portrays whoever it's determined is our opponent as not following international norms and playing by the rules. But please remember, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for a while it appeared the US stood alone as a global power, power, our President George Bush Jr. declared in a State of the Union address leading up to our invasion of Iraq, the U.S. does not need to get a permission slip from the UN, and his list of a coalition of the willing included Poland and El Salvador. Remember, too, the fossil fuel petrochemical industry tie-ins and the hopes expressed in the background in our media of the Iraqi oil fields being opened up to international business interests, and Bush choosing to walk away from the Kyoto Climate Accord, which was the big global climate agreement of the day, focused on reducing fossil fuels. And now to this day, Iraq is in chaos. We and NATO also provided air cover to the Libyan insurrection, and now Libya is in chaos. Look up slave trade return to Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi. Barely talked about. We supported the uprising in Syria. Syria is in chaos. And completely underreported has been our support for, in one form or another, various coups in Latin America and the Caribbean, notably Aristide during the Bush administration again, but also later in Honduras and Bolivia. We'll flip it all around. Our media, our politicians, and our public, therefore, were willing to accept we don't need no permission slip from no United Nations. We got our coalition of the willing. Any nation could declare that. When I heard that statement at the time, I thought Bush is setting a stage for a future of might makes right. These conflicts also become the justification or even the excuse, in my opinion, for the doubling down of fossil fuel production. That in turn strengthens that industry's lobbying power and influence in our media. From the Chevron website, you can see that Chevron is involved in former Soviet satellite states like Kazakhstan. Well, we know the Russian oligarchs are also heavily involved in oil and gas. So now does this look like a battle between who shall control those oil reserves again? Oil reserves that should be left in the ground. That Kyoto Agreement should have been respected. We should have been on track to scaling back on fossil fuels all of these years. Yet now we hear calls for even more fossil fuels. From Fox News, I saw an article that appeared supportive to me of the Republican calls to reopen the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, pundits on outlets like Fox News like to claim that Russia invaded now because of Biden's perceived weakness. But that's a statement anyone can make. Someone could also make the statement Russia decided to invade now because they would prefer someone like Trump in office. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm just saying when you make these blanket statements, anyone can make them. Not tough enough is not the lesson. A future of all bellicose, saber-rattling world leaders who take us to brinksmanship every time is a recipe for climate catastrophe and a future of more conflict. The media should, but isn't, exposing and examining the economic incentives not to seek peace, to keep burning fossil fuels, and to defend business as usual. Petrochemical industry and defense industry in particular, campaign contributions and connections to media outlets should be examined and exposed, as should the hidden privatization agendas that are often married to anti-socialist rhetoric. When America was at the height of wealth and power after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was the best time to have argued for a world of strong international agreements and a respected and fair United Nations. These are the lessons the media is for the most part not giving us. Well, I hope you found this critique really helpful and interesting and informative. And if so, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. You've clicked that notification bell. You're commenting. Supportive comments and constructive criticism are appreciated. And please also become a patron at Patreon. And as always, until next time, peace be with you.